In this lecture, we're going to cover the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, and in particular, his policies towards Mexico. Wilson had a different approach than Roosevelt and Taft, and his policy or his kind of diplomacy was known as moral diplomacy or missionary diplomacy. And the central idea in this is this whole idea that the goal of the United States was to teach other countries, and you see that in this, illustration right here, Woodrow Wilson teaching the countries of Nicaragua and Mexico and Venezuela. Teach them. The goal of the U.S. was to be a moral guardian, to spread ideas such as democracy. So the goal is clear. Mexico, pero adelante, Andrés. Y la primera pizarra viene. ¡Gol! ¡Gol! So the goal, the U.S. should be the conscience of the world. We should be the ones to spread democracy and promote peace and, of course, U.S. interests. So that's Wilson's approach. He's a very moral or idealistic person when it comes to his foreign policy. Now, this policy is going to be directly challenged in the country south of our borders, Mexico. And what was going on in Mexico was basically in 1911, there is a revolution.
Let me be your ruler, ruler. You can call me Queen Bee, and baby I'll rule.
And a big cause for this revolution is that the people of Mexico for 3 decades were under the brutal rule of a guy by the name of Porfirio Diaz. There's Diaz as a young man, there's Diaz in black and white, and there's Diaz in color. And for 3 decades, basically, Porfirio Diaz ran a very undemocratic system. Foreign companies came in, a lot of American businesses and other international companies dominated the oil industry and the railroads and other companies, and there was a huge amount of poverty and inequality in Mexico. So when you have a situation like this, of course, the ingredients are ripe for
say you want a revolution, well, you know, we all want to change the world.
revolution. And in 1911, you have the Mexican Revolution begin, and one of the leaders of that revolution is this guy, Francisco Madero. Madero and his supporters overthrow Diaz's regime, and he starts promising a whole bunch of reforms, land reform and reform for the poor and farmers and everybody, and there is a popular uprising, and this is the Mexican Revolution. Now what happens is Madero has a problem trying to satisfy all of the promises and the reforms, and the situation is very complicated, and change doesn't happen quick enough for some people, and other people are trying to take control. And what happens to Madero is...
Did somebody order Mexican?
He is taken over. Another individual by the name of Huerta takes power from Madero. Madero is killed, and Huerta becomes the leader of Mexico. And Huerta is not as interested in all this reform stuff. He basically establishes himself as a dictator. He is a military man, and he establishes a dictatorship over Mexico. So there's this power struggle in Mexico that I'm way oversimplifying, and Huerta's in charge in the United States.
Did somebody order Mexican?
Wilson, in particular, does not like the government of Huerta. In fact, Wilson calls Huerta's government a government of butchers. And here you see Wilson in this political cartoon basically lecturing the Mexican people about their government and about their choice of leadership. And so Wilson refuses to recognize the regime of Huerta because it was undemocratic. And remember, Wilson, he wants to represent democracy and all these ideals. And he also wants American interest, and Huerta wasn't interested in, seeing that. Now here's what happens.
Denied.
We reject Huerta. We refuse to recognize Huerta. And the situation grows tense because off the coast of a place called Tampico, not the disgusting orange juice that you think is juice, but it's really not. It's just sugared with dye and everything else. Off the coast of Tampico, some of Huerta's men end up arresting some U.S. sailors. And it's a big old mix-up. These guys are arrested. They're taken off American ship. They're released not too soon after that, and the government of Mexico apologizes, but Wilson has his excuse now. Mexico has harassed Americans off the coast of Tampico. And what happens next is Wilson sends in troops to go take over the port city of Veracruz. And the U.S. sends in the troops. In fact, here you see U.S. naval ships coming into Veracruz. The American flag is raised over the fort, and the United States is occupying the city. And both sides, the United States and Mexico, are very, very close to war. In fact, you got some people dying on both sides. There's like 18 Americans who are killed, about 200 Mexican soldiers who are killed, and the whole thing's just kind of chaotic. Now, what ends up happening is a whole bunch of internal things in Mexico, but the United States, Wilson recognizes a new leader of Mexico who overthrows Huerta.
Did somebody order Mexican?
With the last name of Carranza. So Wilson now recognizes this guy, Carranza, as the legitimate leader of Mexico. So there's this whole back and forth, and that's what happens in revolutions. You have people seizing control and other people overthrowing them, and the Mexican Revolution is fascinating and very complicated. So once again, real basics here. Now, Wilson recognizes Carranza. Meanwhile, there's a couple of guys rather, who don't quite like all of this U.S. intervention. And one of those guys you see in this image here, a man by the name of Francisco Pancho Villa. Now, in the beginning, Pancho Villa, and here he is with the American general John J. Pershing, they were buds. Pancho Villa and the United States were cooperating with one another. Now when the United States recognized Carranza, there's a split. And Pancho Villa and another guy by the name of Zapata begin resisting American influence in Mexico. In fact, Pancho Villa leads some kind of controversial raids. One, a group of his men end up taking some American engineers off of a train as they're heading into northern Mexico with the permission of the Carranza government. Those American engineers are taken off of the train and killed. Not too long after that, Pancho Villa and his men cross the border into the United States, into New Mexico, at a little town called Columbus, in March, and kill 17 U.S. citizens and burn down this small town. So you have this tension increasing. Now, people are offering rewards for the capture of Pancho Villa. Wilson is outraged and he calls in the troops, and we need somebody to try and defeat this man, Pancho Villa. And what ends up happening is Wilson finds this guy. You have Pancho Villa leading these raids, and he sends in an individual to go capture this Mexican rebel.
His reputation is expanding faster than the universe. He once had an awkward moment, just to see how it feels. He lives vicariously through himself. He is the most interesting man in the world.
And the guy that he picks is not the handsome guy you see on the screen. It's a guy by the name of John J. Pershing. John J. Pershing ends up taking 15,000 U.S. soldiers into Mexican territory looking for Pancho Villa on a mission to capture dead or alive. And Pancho Villa is on the run, the great pursuit. John J. Pershing looking for Pancho Villa, the bandit, the rebel, in the minds of the Americans, the hero, the guy who's standing up to the Yankee bullies of the North in Mexico. And he has a hard time. He's looking for him for like a year. And here you see John J. Pershing tied to a cactus as a Pancho Villa looking figure waves mocking Pershing's pursuit. Wilson calls 150,000 National Guards people to the border of the U.S. and Mexico to defend, and the situation is very close to war.
Yeah, this is for the raza. This is for the raza.
And for over a year, Pancho Villa eludes capture by the U.S. military. After about a year, though, the situation eventually kind of fades away. And a big reason is there's a war going on in Europe by this point, and our attention turns elsewhere. And so you have this Mexican Revolution and U.S. involvement in the Mexican Revolution causing controversy and tension. You have a series of leaders who are coming to power and then being overthrown. And the big idea here is McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, all of those individuals are showing a U.S. willingness to intervene in both Latin America and Asia. And this intervention is causing tensions and new challenges for the United States. That concludes the lecture. Study, si se puede.